I'm Andrew Milne, and you're listening to the Celtic Soul Podcast, and you're all very welcome to episode number 52. Today on the show, I'll be joined by Paul McQuade to talk about all things Celtic, and he's going to let us into his Celtic soul. Paul is the editor of retro Celtic fanzine, The Shamrock, and he has written 3 books on Celtic, and at the moment he's spending a lot of time researching and writing his 4th book, a biography of Johnny Doyle. He is also a founding member of the Celtic Graves Association and the man behind the Walking Walfrid Tour. So plenty to chat about the Paul, and a man who does so much for Celtic fandom. This episode of the podcast has been sponsored by Dublin-based Celtic Supporters Club, Nave Park. Thanks very much to Mark, Kieran and all the crew for the continued support of the podcast and for supporting the fanzine for over 20 years, and to the individual members of the club who also subscribe to the mag. So listen, boys and girls, thank you very, very much. If your business or Celtic Supporters Club like what we're doing with the podcast and you'd like to sponsor an episode, it doesn't cost too much, so don't be afraid to contact us at info@celticfanzine.com. And as always, you can contact us through the website or on social media. We're on most of the platforms, except the ones for the young ones, the Snapchat and the TikTok. If you're a listener or a reader or both, you can support our independent Celtic media platform by visiting CelticFanzine.com, where you can become a member, subscribe, buy or donate for the price of a pint. Membership starts at $7.99, subscriptions to the fanzine start at $5.99. Visit our online shop. You can buy the latest fanzine from $2.50 and merchandise from $5. You can also donate to help us fund the platform, which includes this free podcast you're listening to. Your support will help us to continue to produce quality fan independent journalism, fanzines, podcasts, video content and fan events. Please keep all the comments coming in and suggestions for guests. As always, we reach out to everybody suggested and we'll try and get them in for a chat and let us dig into their Celtic soul. Here's a few comments we received since the last episode. That's a morning and a half for Dander, accompanied by the Celtic Soul Podcast with Dr. Joe and a chat with David Potter, who's written 30 books on Celtic. Music by Deck McLaughlin thrown in, and that comes from Chris and Derry. Thank you, Chris, for the comments. Superb listening again, Millish, helping me through the overtime on a Sunday. Mark McCabe, a dub stranded in Glasgow. Come on, Mark. Another interview which as ever hits the impressive Celtic Soul high standards. Loved hearing about former boys such as Tom McAdam, Pat Staunton, Bobby Evans, Charlie Tully, the overseas players that play for Celtic, and David Potter's take on Lenny, Dr. Joe, Tommy Dock and Shuggy. Keep up the good work, Andrew. And that comes in from Tony Ratton in Sunderland. Would listen to David Potter talk all day about Celtic. A wonderful walking encyclopedia on our great club for all fans. Kieran Kenny in Dublin. Cheers, Kieran, for that comment. Just a quick message to say I started listening to your podcast over the past few days and it is excellent. I think it is sometimes easy to take for granted the level of talent, skill and commitment we have in our support. But your show and the guests you have on make you appreciate it again. It brings back a bit of pride, which is a godsend in the current climate. Fills you with confidence for the future. Still working my way through older shows, but well done again on putting it all together. And that comes in from Ross. Not sure where Ross is based, but thanks very much, Ross, and nice thought out words. Tuesday night, Rugby Park, empty stands, where we once bounced around to the sound of Just Can't Get Enough. Where Scott Brown won the league, and who could forget when Shunsuke Nakamura scored a trademark free kick there in the last minute to crown Celtic champions. We've had plenty of talent pass through the Parkhead gates since then, but have we really had an entertainer of his quality? What a player. Scott Byrne returned to the plastic pitch against Kilmarnock, and he did show his leadership qualities, opening the scoring in a 4-0 win. Eddie back on the score sheet, 2 goals, nice one. And Ayeti, remember him? Welcome back, but I believe it's been short-lived. You've been cited for diving, and you're out for 2 games. Not sure how true that is, but just one of the boys is saying it here in the studio. Now, Ayeti, if you are cited for diving, please tell Barkas how to do it, because I haven't seen him diving yet all season, and I'm probably being a bit harsh on the Greek international, but really, you need to step up a little there, Barkas. Anyway, John Joe Kenny started off his Celtic career with a win after he joined on transfer deadline day, while Olivier Incham headed for Marseille, and his new manager, Andre Villas-Boas, resigned because the board went over his head and he didn't want the want-away Celtic player. Celtic fan Boyle67 on Twitter summed it up. Olivia in Sham wants to go to Marseille. The fans were setting fire to the training ground yesterday, and that's still a more attractive prospect than staying at Celtic. Fair play to Villas-Boas, a man of principle, walked away without wanting any money. Football before finance. There's too much influence from the suits in the dressing room at most clubs. Some of them never kicked the ball in their life, but their world beaters are interference. Leave football to the footballers and the football coaches. Tuesday's performance was positive. The players looked up for it. Neil Lennon rang in the changes after the embarrassing performance against St Mirren. The positive result and performance had an effect on social media and in the WhatsApp groups, and the effect was silence, with a lot less clattering of keyboards and smartphones. The performance in Kilmarnock has maybe acted as a stay of execution for Lenny, who by the way sounded very confident in his press conference on the eve of the game when asked about his position. How he has survived to stay in the job after January's results is incredible, but while he has the backing of the board, we must support him and the team for each 90 minutes. For Celtic Football Club is bigger than any one man, and we, the fans, are the heartbeat of Celtic. We are Celtic. Paul McQuade is the editor of the Shamrock Fanzine and the man behind the Shamrock website. He's also the man behind the Walfrid Walking Tours and is a founding member of the Celtic Graves Association. He has written 3 books on Celtic, said Lizzy to Philip, how Celtic gay crashed to Coronation. This is how it feels to be Celtic, an account of the Invincible season. He's wrote a quote book on Celtic which came out just before Christmas, and he is currently writing a biography of Johnny Doyle. Well, Paul, you've been busy. You're very welcome to the Celtic Soul Podcast. We had a positive result on Tuesday night after the very, very disappointing performance against St Mirren at the weekend, which once again saw the Celtic fans take to social media to call for Neil Lennon to be sacked or for him to resign. But he remains defiant, and in recent press conferences, he says he's going nowhere. To have that much confidence, it would suggest he has the backing of Dermot Desmond and the Celtic board.
Yeah, interesting times, Andrew. No getting away from it. Things are just happening so quickly at Celtic the past few months. It's been almost impossible to keep up. But at least we had the comfort of a decent performance last night, which was good to see. Scott Brown back to his irrepressible self as well. And at least makes up a little bit for the disappointment of that St Mirren game. It'll be very interesting to see what happens between now and the end of the season. I would be amazed if they would stick with Neil Lennon as long as the end of the season. But as you said, it would appear that people's tempers are getting increasingly out of control with it all, So interesting times all round. I think, such is a disappointment of what's happened this season. It's going to take us a while to go over it. But already you could see again last night, especially the performance of some of our more recent signings. I think we've got some stuff to look forward to.
Well, I'm glad we have a bit of positivity because up to last night, it was so negative. And it's funny, with the good results last night, and this podcast will go out Friday, but for the listeners, we are recording this interview on Wednesday because Paul is a busy man. But anyway, Paul, the WhatsApp group last night was quite actually compared to previous games when it was red hot. That's the WhatsApp group of my supporters club St Margaret's, and as well, I dipped into social media after the game, which sometimes I don't do, but I did dip in last night, and it was quite as well. But as Celtic fans, I think we were all happy that we saw a good performance. Kilmarnock are definitely a team in trouble. I hate that plastic pitch. I'm always worried about losing decent players to injury on it. But look, as you say, it was a good result. Scott Brown was back, and many of us wrote him off. We can lead from the front because it is needed. The St Mirren game was up there, but as bad a performance as I've seen this season, yeah. And we've seen so many bad performances. I suppose January was the month like no other. We call ourselves a club like no other, but January was a month like no other. We went into that Rangers game confident because we had, with Turnbull and Sorrow coming into the team, I thought, we have a good chance here. We played them off the park. We had the craziness of Beaton's red card. They get the 3 points, and then the team flies off to the bye. We've had to fall out from that. Though there's been no sight or sound of this January review we were promised when the fences outside Celtic Park were getting rattled. The only news we heard in January was Peter Lawwell apologising for the winter break in the sun, and then the announcement that he's going to retire after 17 years as CEO. But the one we wanted to hear was what came out of this January review, or was there a January review?
I think there is a January review. I think much like the whole added value issue. It's something that the club have put out there in the hope that the supporters would forget about it, would move on. The club certainly didn't anticipate the season that we've had. And now, we're obviously a few days into February and still no actual news as to what the review has decided. So I think that just lip service on the part of the club, in all honesty. January, very difficult month again. I mean, for the Hibs game, I basically had to persuade my son in order to watch it. I had to say, look, go to watch it. We're probably going to end up putting out a youth team tonight, we'll have a laugh watching it, it'll be good. And then we all ended up with a late goal, thinking this is actually brilliant, and turned it around. And of course we conceded straight after that, and things didn't get much better for the rest of the month, and the performances certainly didn't get any better. But I think at least for some in the support, the fact that Peter Lawwell's decided to step down is seen as a positive development, because it suggests there's going to be some change ahead, and certainly for me, I would like to see a lot of change in regard to the way the club speaks to the fans, communicates with the fans. I think that's just come to a grinding halt in recent months. And there's been a lot of rumours, that Peter Lawwell was going to retire, and it's come to pass. And it kind of, in my mind, it just kind of fuels this view that the club's just kind of gone down a couple of gears, in terms of PR, other things out with the actual football team itself, and we're losing focus. The trip to Dubai is part of that. It seems as though the club actually had some strong arguments that they could have countered some of the criticism of Dubai, but yet the way it was all handled, and then when Peter Lawwell did apologise, then Neil Lennon seemed to contradict him. You just thought, it was so frustrating for the support just to see this lack of leadership. And in many respects, I think it's a bit sad that this is what a lot of people will remember Peter Lawwell's time as chief executive, that it's ended in the way that it has. Anybody running a football club, of course, football performances, the team's performances are absolutely crucial, and they were very good for so long. And now we're just obviously having to deal with the fallout of all that, But try and be as positive as I can, try and find the humour in situations where I can. And I certainly think that's something that, as a support, we're generally quite good at, So in the midst of all the accusations and counterclaims about Neil Lennon's status and the red circle with a line through it and all the rest of it, I still find some humour, in the way that the fans are dealing with it. Some people overreacting. I think the real danger for us as a club and as a support, though, is that apathy starts to set in. People don't watch the games as much as they did, start to lose a wee bit of interest. And that, to me, is the real challenge for Peter Lawwell, because he's still the chief executive for the next few months. The club need to do more to get the supporters reinvested in this season. We need to come back with a much stronger challenge in the league. We need to do much better, hopefully, in the cup competition if it runs as well. There's a lot to be salvaged from this season, because the idea of having to go through February, March, April, May, performances that we've had with little to look forward to, having paid full whack to watch it online, is just going to be unacceptable. So the club still needs to step up. It's not a question of just because Peter Lawwell's decided to resign, they close the doors until June or July.
Yeah, Paul, it's funny you should say that fans may lose interest. I know a couple of fans who would get up, in the middle of the night, early morning, to head to Belfast to get the ferry. They run supporters buses. I seen two in particular commenting on social media, and I was surprised. And both of them had said rather than watch the match, they'd gone for a walk. And these are not Johnny-come-lately fans. These are boys that have been going for years and years. One actually runs a bus. So for them to say that they're losing interest, and I had another. I had Henry, who's the sub-editor of the fanzine. I had Henry on the podcast before Christmas, and he had said that he lives in Glasgow, and he had said that people are getting used to doing other stuff. He's now spending time with his grandchildren that he would have spent watching Celtic.
Yeah.
And he said, and I'm enjoying it. And he's a man in his 60s, So, Celtic should never take the Celtic support for granted, because there are other options for a Saturday afternoon or a Sunday. And if people who are running buses and are prepared to get up in the middle of the night to go to Belfast and get in a ferry, spend their day travelling, a couple of pints and to watch Celtic, and they're saying, well, I'm not going to watch it anymore, I'm going for a walk. That sets alarm bells off in my head. Is the club hierarchy so far removed from the average fan on the street that they can't see this?
That's a real concern that I have, that they don't really seem to understand some of the things that matter to the supporters, They mishandled the whole issue of the season ticket refund, and I think they've paid for that. That's cost them, because a lot more fans have now sought a refund for last year than we're ever interested in. It's almost become a bit of a protest, I think, to actually go and get the refund. And they just seem to have lost, having shown good touch for a number of years, in terms of dealing with the support and keeping the support on side. They just seem to have lost interest in that. And that's a definite concern. As you said, Andrew, there's guys I know as well, real diehards, and interest some of them, watching the game, watching bits of the game, We've lost the social side of football, and for a club like Celtic, that's absolutely crucial for a support like ours as well, because for so many people I know, what you miss is the fact you get to meet up with people that you know very well. You miss the trips to away games, you miss the trips to Europe as well, and these are the things that people live for, So watching 90 minutes on your computer doesn't really come close, and actually the experience of watching Celtic play in empty stadiums is quite hard going, I'd actually much rather they did it without the funneled noise like they had on at times last night. I want to hear Neil Lennon swearing, I want to hear him calling out Jim Goodwin like before. I want to hear what the players are shouting at each other as well. But the whole thing's just quite strange. So Celtic and other clubs need to be careful in terms of how they continue to manage this, And this kind of loss of engagement with the fans is a real concern. They need to step up in that sense, This January review you mentioned, still nothing, For a club that down the years have been very fond of issuing statements when it suits them, nothing coming from the chief executive, and a kind of lack of leadership, as I said earlier. It's dangerous. It's dangerous when it was in the Ronnie Doyle years as well, when Neil Lennon left the club first time round as manager. I just get the impression with the appointment of Ronnie Doyle, as exciting as that was at times, the club was almost put into cold storage. They got a fairly cheap manager's replacement. There was a clear drop in attendances at Celtic Park, and the club just seemed to be happy to let that go on. And then fortunately, Brendan Rodgers was available and wanted to come, and they managed to get Brendan Rodgers, and everything changed radically in a short period of time. And we had those 3 years of unprecedented success. Absolutely incredible. Looking back on it, as things stand at the moment, we've just watched our team win 12 trophies in succession. It's absolutely unbelievable. Going to Hampden 2-3 times a year, constantly winning, is something I'll never forget and never stop savouring, because so many great moments in all the ways and all those different finals and semi-finals. And before that, we had a bit of a Hampden hoodoo, and Neil Lennon did exceptionally well taking over in the circumstances that he did. And I can understand why, for a lot of the older supporters, they don't like to see Neil Lennon get any kind of criticism. But at the same time, for a big body of the support, current performances, going over months now, unacceptable. So I think the season could have been salvaged earlier if they changed manager. Easy to say that in hindsight. For me, the turning point was the Sparta Prague game at home, 4-1 at home. I don't think Neil Lennon would have survived as manager that night if the crowds were in. For other people, it came before with the Rangers game, the Fenerbahce game. Fenerbahce, who am I thinking of? Champions League exit.
Ferencvaros.
Sorry, yeah.
I got tongue-tied there myself.
Help me out, though. For other people, it was after Sparta Prague and the Rangers game as well. But mid-January, it's almost universal. It seems to me the support want a new manager. And the club, again, they're not communicating what they're intending and doing. They've backed Neil Lennon, which they're perfectly entitled to do, but coming up this close to season ticket renewal, it seems to me quite a dangerous strategy they're playing.
Yeah, I could be wrong, but I think we may have to wait for the announcement of a manager, because there's a possibility, and I could be wide off the mark here, but I think, Dermot Desmond didn't get where he is without, being a clever man. And I just think that he has to have a plan B, and maybe he has a manager in mind that they can't announce because he may be under contract. That's the only logical thing I can think of, because after the January we've witnessed, I'm just very surprised. And I've backed Neil up until December. I'd said no. When we went out of Europe, I said no, he deserves a shot, he deserves his chance. In December, I said, look, if we go on a run in December, we've a League Cup game, we should win, which we didn't. Then we had, then we dropped points to St Johnstone. Obviously, we dropped points down to Rangers. But I thought if we had gone on a run and beat Rangers at Ibrox, that we could have that, the momentum would carry us then. But obviously, we didn't have the December we all thought we would have. And we had more disappointment. So it's not as if I've been calling since we didn't qualify for the Champions League for Neil Lennon to be sacked. And it's nothing personal, and I wouldn't be personal about it, but I think that, without change, I think there's too much water was going under the bridge now. I think, we need fresh ideas and maybe a fresh start. And if that means fresh start is building for next season, well then so be it, because the disappointment of this season will take us through the summer. And I suppose I'm lucky. I don't meet too many Rangers fans. There's one in the whole building that I have my office in, and he's working from home, so he can't even glow because I've given him some stick, over the years. But like, I can imagine for those who are working in Glasgow now or Scotland, it must be. Look, and I know they've given it to them for 9 years, but still, it's so hard to take, and that's where the frustration is boiling over there. Where in the isolation of my hometown, Drogheda, I'm not going to have a summer where I'm going to be seeing many Rangers jerseys or jumping in and out of arguments with them. So I suppose from that point of view, I'm in a safe zone. But for you boys in Glasgow and you girls in Glasgow, it's going to be a different tale. Look, anyway, we spoke enough about the current situation, and it may pop up again before we finish. Look, Paul, obviously, you have a huge love and knowledge of Celtic. So take me back to a young Paul McQuade. Tell us a little bit about yourself growing up, starting to follow Celtic, and then continuing into getting involved in bits and pieces.
Well, grew up initially in Lanarkshire, so not far from Glasgow, in a wee village called Muirhill. Dad's a Celtic fan. He's not a massive Celtic fan. He's only through his adult life went to games occasionally. First went to Celtic Park. I think it was a friendly against Penarol, the Uruguayan team. So probably in about 76, I would have been 5 at the time. I seem to remember my big cousin took me, my brother, and 2 cousins along. Very limited memories of that, given the age, but I kind of remember a little bit about the old ground. But then we moved to Fife. I got more interested in Celtic going through school. One of the boys I befriended became best friends with, my pal Alex. He was a huge Celtic fan. So he was at the Real Madrid game in 1980. He was telling me all these stories. And then I didn't get back to Celtic Park. The first actual competitive game was 11th birthday present from my parents, so that was 1981. The way it's turned out is quite incredible. Johnny Doyle died on my 11th birthday, so that was my birthday present, was to get to Celtic Park, and it was the first home game after Johnny's death. And we were in the main stand. My dad was always quite anxious going to Celtic Park. Never took me and my brother into the jungle. It was usually the main stand or sometimes the big terracing. So we're in the main stand that day, beat Aberdeen 2-1. Saw Gordon Strachan up close, annoying all the Celtic fans. And from then on, that was it. I was pressuring my dad to bring me through from Fife for games, and he was getting a bit more into it. I remember he made a big exception, come through to see Celtic because we signed Maurice Johnston in 1984, because that was a big thing, But he was a cracking striker, so that was exciting.
Never heard of him.
Well, I think it was that day. It was certainly that season. I persuaded my dad to hang about outside so I could get some autographs in front of the old stand. And he bought me a Celtic pennant from the store. And I got 3 Celtic autographs: Alan McInally, Pierce O'Leary, and Maurice Johnston. And they'd all left within a year as well. So it was a pretty redundant pennant after a while. But the other big thing that happened was Alec had a neighbour who used to take him to the big games, supporters bus from Fife, and then Alec and I started going on that on occasions, and then occasional Rangers games as well, where we would lie to our parents, would make up fictional 5-a-side tournaments in Perth so that we could skip away on the supporters bus. And the big concern there was you could get on the bus in Glenorchy, that would have been the Cowdenbeath supporters bus, but it wasn't until like 4 stops on until they knew if they had enough tickets for you to get one. So I was quite nervous for the first 40 minutes or so. But in fact, every time we were sorted and we got through. So we saw our first couple of Celtic Rangers games together. And that was it. And then my dad was getting into it a bit more, and he was taking us through Davy Provin's testimonial at the Notts Forest Notts Forest game in Europe in 83. That was my first European game. So between my dad and my pal Alex, the love for Celtic developed from there. And then as I got older, I realised that Celtic connection with my family went back a long way. So I used to stay where I grew up initially, Newt Hill in Carfin. I used to go and stay there in the summer with my great aunt. Her son had been a big Celtic fan. He had all these books, which she just gifted to me. One of Tom Campbell's first book about Celtic post-war, and the Bob Kelly book as well. So I was reading up the history of the club from about the age of 14, 15 onwards. And it's ever since then, it's always just been exciting for me, I don't go with these claims that say, Celtic's a club like no other, these kind of corporate slogans. They're all fairly meaningless. But I think we've got a history which is quite unique. And that's because of the nature of the support that we have, which is quite unique as well. So it's become a bit of a passion, as well as supporting the club. It's become a passion finding out more about the people who've made Celtic the club they are, but also the support and the fans and everything that's wrapped up in it. And I think that's what makes Celtic really quite different,
Yeah, and your fanzine is a little different than the other fanzines, including my own, and Not the View and the Alternative View. Give the boys a shout out. Fair play to them for keeping print alive.
Yeah.
For us old timers. But yours is a little different because yours is more historical. It doesn't really deal with the ins and outs of the day, but it delves back, and it's fantastic. I love it. And I think my favourite cover is the one coming out, Billy McNeil coming out of the tunnel in Lisbon, or in Argentina, excuse me. I think that's a fabulous picture. And if anyone gets the chance, go onto the Shamrock website and you'll be able to purchase the fanzines and have a look at the covers. Even they're beautiful. The covers alone are a beautiful art, I think, and they do draw you in. But then it's when you get inside and you read what's inside, it's quality. So obviously this goes back to getting these books gifted to you.
Yeah, and then the experience of being on supporters' buses, and some of the characters that used to be in the Cowdenbeath bus. And I mean, I wasn't on that any week by any stretch of imagination. I didn't have the money. But as I said, it was enough with the games my dad would take me to, and then the games that Alex and I would go to as well. By the time the centenary season came round, and I was 17 last year at school, getting ready to go to uni and all the rest of it, it was already a huge part of my life. Not the View had just started. I'd heard about Not the View, I think, from issue 2 onwards. I used to sell it in school. I then got to know George and Jerry. Used to sell it at the games, and Joe as well. So I was involved in a very, very little bit with that by the time I was a student. But the next big thing was, as a student, I went to Edinburgh Uni. And the supporters club there, the Harry Watt Edinburgh Uni's bus, had been going for a few years. And the boys who ran it, who were in the years before me, they're all still good pals. And girls who've joined the club since, it's a brilliant club. So the friendships and the stories that then came from being part of that supporters club itself, and then other supporters clubs in Edinburgh as well, getting to know those boys. We do joint buses and away trips and all this. Absolutely brilliant, just one adventure after another. And you know how fond Celtic fans of my age are of talking about the gruelling 90s. I think actually probably the season I went to most games would have been about 91 or 92. And Celtic were dreadful. There's no getting away from it. But the support just kept going, and that's the thing that I think that we're missing at the moment. And we're starting to realise it's this whole social side to supporting Celtic, which is so important. So even though the team were dreadful and the club were in absolute disarray at that period of time, the support were still having good fun. From the Tony Mowbray testimonial, there's a picture of a banner in the Celtic crowd at that game, and it's the old Monty Python song that the fans were chanting at the time, always look on the bright side of life, And we were going through a time in our history, it's one of the worst, almost as bad as the 40s into the early 50s, and then the early 60s before Jock came. But the fans were there, and you still see people talking on some of the forums about some of the brilliant trips they had in the 90s. And that's the thing, that's never going to change. So even if we go through a period of relative lack of success over the next year or two, and the home attendances dip, it's fine, Celtic will get through it because the support always get them through it. And that's the kind of stuff makes me very philosophical about times like this. I always do my best to enjoy the great moments, and that's why, we've just come through this incredible period of success in the club's history, and we absolutely lapped it up. For a year or two there, you'd see fans from other clubs saying, "Oh, you must be getting sick of this. Yeah, it certainly wasn't. It was one fantastic memory after another, watching great football, great quality football, and all these memorable events coming so close together. But time moves on, and even as difficult as it is now, generally, there's still, as I said, with all the spats you get online, there's so much humour still amongst a lot of the stuff that the Celtic fans do, and that's always been one of the big attractions.
Yeah, I think the best I've seen on social media was on Twitter. About someone posted up when Insham was going to Marseille, and he said the fans are born at the training ground, and it still looks like a better option. But and then obviously we had the fallout of Insham. The manager resigning because they signed Insham. But I have to say, Villas-Boas, you have to take your hat off to him because this has been happening at Celtic since Gordon Strachan was there. When you think back, he didn't know who Paddy McCourt was when he arrived.
Yeah, exactly.
Dermot Desmond had signed Paddy McCourt on the recommendation of someone who watched Paddy in the League of Ireland. And by the way, Paddy was outstanding in the League of Ireland, Went on to be a cult hero at Celtic. But Paddy has said that a friend knew Dermot and knew Paddy was speaking to English club. And, the call went into Dermot. Dermot obviously rang Peter Law. Well, I don't think Peter rang Gordon Strachan because, the Thomas Graviton signing remains a mystery to everybody. And Roy Keane, an injured and aging Roy Keane comes up for a couple of months, Strachan, I suppose if you read between the lines in interviews, he wasn't expecting him to come either. So there's, Man O'Neill obviously, was the man. He ran the club from top to bottom. He seemed to have Dermot in his pocket. And I was at a dinner one night with Martin O'Neill in Drogheda for the Gary Kelly Cancer Centre, and Martin was the guest. And all Dermot Desmond's staff were sitting at the table with him. So he definitely had a huge influence on Dermot, as the other guy that rang up with Paddy McCourt must have. And then if you go back further, when you talk to the Lisbon Lions, we interviewed the Lisbon Lions and such. Before Jock Stein came in, the board were picking the team. The chairman was picking the team. So there's always been outside influence on the manager, but since Strachan came in, well, we don't really know much about Mowbray, but maybe he didn't want Robbie Keane to come in and save him because he certainly didn't. And I suppose the start of it was when Lenny left and Ronnie came in, because we're told that Ronnie was supposed to be his number 2 because they wanted to start selecting the coaching staff as well. And obviously, when you look at the dugout now, it would seem that way. So, the interference is always there. But without going off track with Villas-Boas and the Insham thing, which is, as you say, you'll always get a laugh, every day being a Celtic fan. It might be hard at the moment, but there is still some crack to be had among the fans and some great humour. But you were saying there about the stories you heard on the Edinburgh University bus. Funny, Kieran Kenny was on a couple of months ago, and Kieran runs the Nave Porrick bus, and he writes for the Fanzine. And I served my apprenticeship on those boats, listening to these stories from, elderly gentlemen. And especially when I started the Fanzine, because they all started telling me stories to put in it. Yeah. And I don't travel on the boat now, not very often. I normally fly now, but Kieran's still in the boat. And some of the gentlemen that would have told me the stories have passed away or are too old to go now. And we were saying, we should have captured. There was no podcast then when we, not much social media. You had a Fanzine, and I think you had dial-up website. So you hadn't got the. I had a dictaphone. I remember when I interviewed Tommy Gemmell. So that was kind of that was the state of the art one. I didn't have to put a mic in. There was a built-in microphone. That was really, really good. Because Tommy was actually the first person I interviewed for the Fanzine. Wow. Back in Uri in the back of a shop. It's very glamorous. He was launching a Celtic support shop, and I gay crashed and got my first interview in the stock room. Wow. But anyway, and there was all these great stories, and so myself and Kieran said, look, why don't we bring a book out of these stories? So it's kind of went off the agenda. We haven't really spoke about it since, but we're going to do it, and probably the line will go down to get people to write chapters, because I don't know anything about a book, so you might be able to help me out.
Indeed,
maybe you might write a chapter about, the 1991 season and travelling on that bus, if you can still remember, and maybe some of the characters and the stories, because if we don't get these stories down now, it's different now with the podcast. There's great stories coming out, players are telling stories, and the likes of David Potter, who we had on last week, is, you know, he's giving you a history lesson. And,
Yeah,
so, you know, like the school teacher he is. But there's so much we can capture now. And I know, like, we talk about games and we give out about managers and all that, but if we can get, you know, one gem of a story in each podcast, it's great. But if we could put it down in a book, it'd be even better, because I think the history of the fans is probably not as important as the history of the club and what it has achieved and what it stands for. But boy, God, there's some great stories in there that, you know, I've heard stories in pubs, and you're bent over laughing. And I've been on trips, and some of the stuff that has happened, I'll just give it an instance, and I'm not going to say who it was or anything, right? But I met someone that runs a bus in Amsterdam, and he said, "You're not going to believe what's just happened. This was in the red light district in Amsterdam." He says, "One of the young lads on the bus has just been arrested." I said, "For what?" He says, "He was caught with drugs." And I looked around, and everyone's high as a kite. You know, the full story of that bus trip. Oh, anyone's that's gone on them European buses, you know. If you got the stories from them buses, there would be an X-rated book.
Oh, unbelievable.
Maybe you will help us out with a chapter.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly the stuff that fascinates me, Andrew, you know. And it's something that, with the forums, a lot of the stories are on there. You can search them. You know, I've been in the habit of, if I find a story like that about a supporter's bus, I'll probably copy-paste it in a Word document, so you can always find it on your computer, you know. And as you said, there's some legendary stories of the Salt Market bus and some of their trips across Europe. Buses that came back from Turin in 81 with all their windows put in before they'd left Italy. You know, they're travelling through the Alps with no windows. You can laugh about it now, of course, you know. And just some of the songs, some of the stories you hear. There's been a few attempts at trying to capture that down the years, you know. There's a couple of good books kind of out there. There's one actually good one, Celtic and Rangers, that a journalist did probably about early 90s, which is great because it's just people telling their own stories, you know, and there's obviously a bit of a connection between the two supports, which is what was of interest to him. But some of the Celtic stories in that are fantastic, and you'll know a lot of the names of the people that contributed to them as well, because they're still kicking about, you know. So it's become a wee bit easier to put together some of that stuff, you know. I'm particularly interested in the Celtic break clubs. There's a book, I don't think I'm going to remember the author's name, but the book's called The Global Game. It's, you know, 3-4 inch thick history of the sport of football. It's called The Ball is Round. And in it, the author, Celtic only get a couple of fleeting mentions, but in it, he basically says Celtic fans invented away days. Celtic were the first support to actually organise trips to away games in any meaningful sense. And then you come across stories of the break clubs going to games at Motherwell, fighting with a mob outside the Orange Hall near the railway station, which is still there. The Govan break club being attacked by these orange guys. And then on the way back, 4 other break clubs joining the Govan break club to head back to the Orange Hall and what turned into a mini riot. And this is in 1914, you know? So with newspaper archives opening up online as well, and a lot of Scottish and Irish and English papers being included in them, you can now find some of these stories, you know? And that's certainly something that I would like to do a bit more of, and just try and capture some of it as well. But as you said, the technology's there now for people to get these stories down in writing, you know. Myself and my friend Brendan Sweeney, we interviewed a Celtic fan who's 101 years old a couple of times over before the pandemic. And I've been with a view to writing up his kind of life story, you know, in an article form, putting on the website. And hopefully I'll get that done in the next couple of weeks, because the family now will give me some further information. And this is a guy who, and this is where the interest came from Brendan and I, used to drink as a young man in Willie Maley's pub. When Willie Maley was serving behind the bar, and he and his pals would speak to the Celtic players of the day. So we're talking late 20s, early 1930s. And his stories then all the way through, you know, living in Glasgow. Unfortunately, he's still with us. So you're right, the intention there is get the stories down, written, while these people are still here, to share them, you know, because it's this is our social history. and it's absolutely important that we learn it and we learn from it.
Yeah, you mentioned Brendan there. Brendan, another great man, a great Celtic man, and he's been involved in so many things. And his name, we always ask for to keep people to send in their comments and of what they like about or don't like about the podcast. And we also ask them for suggestions. And no matter who is suggested, we reach out if we can. Some of them are kind of outrageous suggestions, but we do reach out and we normally get told to F off in a nice way, or they just don't come back to us. But Brendan's name keeps popping up, and I've asked Brendan, but he's too shy to come on. So, Brendan, if you're listening, and we hope you are, there's a shout out now out public. We want you on the show because you have some story to tell.
He really does, and his most recent book came out just before Christmas there, and he was delighted it came out during the pandemic because it meant he didn't need to do any publicity for it. I can think of only one thing that he did online promoting the early years when it came out, and that was with Jim Craig, and he was happy to do that, and they were taking questions online and answering them live. But you're right, he just hates talking in that kind of public forum about stuff, But if you get him at a Celtic Graves event, then you can hear some of his stories, and absolutely valuable because he's had a kind of front seat in so much of the things that have gone on in Celtic. But even for someone like Brendan, his stories of going to see Celtic as a young boy with his dad and his brothers in the 70s into the 80s, absolutely fantastic as well, And someone you had on recently, Eddie Toner. Eddie's an absolute master with these stories, and Eddie's got this kind of Celtic lineage through his family. I think in that famous video, the Denison #1 bus singing the 7-1 song, I think Eddie's mum might be in that as well. Eddie's granddad used to be the groundsman at Celtic Park. He's got so many stories about that. Absolutely brilliant. So these people are treasures, and this is why it's great to have this kind of forum, to be able to get these people up, get them speaking, and share their stories. But yeah, Brendan, he's much less reluctant, unfortunately.
Yeah, Eddie's podcast was very good and proved. I think we got some new listeners in from Eddie because he's a big follower on Twitter. but Eddie Toner, biker by day, taxi driver by night. But on Brendan, like coming into my head now, Cells for Change, involved with Cells for Change, the Jungle Boys, the original, ultra group at the stadium. His books, his research into these books and the early Celtic history, the fanzine he done, he just has done so much over the years. And yeah, there's people if they get a couple of people that like their tweet or to get the first 1,000 followers on social media, they think they've made it. They think they're Celtic royalty within the fan. But, they should take a leaf out of Brendan's book maybe and see what he's done, because we live in a kind of a world now where everyone wants instant celebrity. Well, Brendan had to work in his and he doesn't really want it. But he is. It's a name that keeps popping up, as I said. Now, you mentioned the Celtic Graves there with Brendan. Is Brendan another founding member of the Celtic Graves?
That's right, yeah. I think there was maybe about... The members really came from the forums, the three big forums, the Kerrial Street, Huddleboard, Celtic Minded. And the guys that are on the committee now, I think we're all original members, except for Kenny. Kenny joined in the last couple of years. So I can still think back. Yeah, Kev came from the Huddleboard. Frank and Jim came from Celtic Minded. Brendan on most of those forums, but I knew Brendan from the Jungle Boys, and Brendan and I had already been looking up graves and stuff, and had looked at some of the people who were buried along the road from Celtic Park in St Peter's Dalbeth. And that was because the book, The Alphabet of the Celts, listed where some of the graves were for guys like Barney Battles. Barney Battles, he died quite young. I think he was still playing football. He wasn't playing for Celtic. Lived in Bridgeton at the time. This is about 1902, 1903. And 20,000 people turned out for Barney Battles' funeral from all the way from Bridgeton up to St Peter's on London Road. Absolutely incredible. And there's a cracking wee headstone still there. So Brendan knew that I'd been doing stuff like that, and he invited me along to that first meeting. And as I said, I think 5 of us at least are still involved, and we're just celebrating our 10th year at the moment. But of course, our events have come to a halt because of the pandemic, but we're still looking and thinking ahead, and we're hoping that we can celebrate Johnny Thompson's anniversary in September this year, because probably the biggest thing that we've done was 10 years ago with the Celtic supporters in Fife, the Lochgelly bus, the Cardenden supporters as well. We helped organise this walk from Celtic Park all the way through to Johnny Thompson's resting place in Cardenden. The inspiration for that was the fact that when he died in 1931, large numbers of Celtic fans didn't have the money, decided to walk through from Glasgow and Lanarkshire and just camped in the hills overlooking Cardenden in order to attend the funeral. So that was the inspiration. And we had about, I think, maybe 30 or 40 people did the walk. People like Brendan Sweeney and I didn't complete it much, but we did get to the Kincardine Bridge on the second day. But quite a few people completed it. And then the Lochgelly bus, after that, they organised, and the Fife-based fans were organising cycles every year from Celtic Park through. So this year, we're hoping we can put on a similar type event, walking from Celtic Park to Cardenden. But of course, it's all up in the air at the moment, Unfortunately, we've not been able to have any of our commemorations, which we love getting involved with. We love doing the research for and the preparation. And increasingly, the events are getting more and more people, And we've had fantastic support from the people at the club down the years as well for these events. And former players have been brilliant coming along, saying a few words as well. So hopefully, that's one of the things we're looking forward to get back doing once all this ends.
Do you look after the graves if there's no family around or anything like that? Or is it just simply commemorating the players at the graveside?
At the start, what we were doing was marking graves of Celtic players that didn't have headstones, So the first one that we did was Dan Doyle, who's buried in Dalbeth. And it turned out unbelievable number of Celtic founding fathers and leading Celtic players, right through to Jimmy McMenemy. Jimmy McGrory's buried there as well. Willie O'Neill, the Lisbon Lion, is buried there too. So all the way from the very first days, John Glass, Dr. Conway, all the leading people that founded the club are buried in Dalbeth as well. So that's fortunate, because that means we could have a lot of ceremonies on match days when the fans are in Glasgow, fans from England, fans from Ireland. We still need to have it about 12 o'clock, though, so it's a wee bit early for some. But that's been really good. It's been a great way to involve more supporters in our events as well. So mostly it was about marking places where headstones had disappeared or maybe had never been there in the first place. And it's through that we've got to know some of the families, and then the families in turn. So if the headstones or the monuments had become weathered to that, we've got this great guy, Danny Rooney, who's a monumental sculptor. Danny comes in, tidies them up for us, and then sometimes the families who are unaware, in some cases, that their ancestors were buried there, they then take on that responsibility. They've gone and had their own ceremonies in some cases as well, So it's really all about identifying resting places that aren't marked, restoring them, keeping them going as well. But because we're now 10 years into it, we're now going to have to consider going back to some of the stones that we've put down and some of the headstones like Willie Maley's. The Willie Maley headstone, that was actually the inspiration for the Grave Society, came through a Celtic fan in Kerrydale Street who'd found Willie Maley's grave in Cathcart Cemetery. And I don't think Willie Maley's name was on it, the family headstone. And the club paid for that to get cleaned up and for Willie Maley's name to get put on it beside his parents, his wife, and his children. And so that was the inspiration for the Grave Society. I thought, well, where else is there, If we've got somebody as important as Willie Maley's grave, which isn't being recognised. And it turned out there's quite a lot, because it's not the fault of the families. If you're 100 years on, even though you've got a famous Celtic in your family, doesn't mean you necessarily know where they're buried, especially given that families have moved around as well. So it's surprising. There's still a lot of work out there to be done, but unfortunately we're kind of halted at the moment. There's certainly a few early Celts that we're still looking to get headstones down, marking stones down for, and a few others like, we've talked for years, want to go over to have an event for Charlie Tully. But again, he's got cracking headstone in Belfast. Have an event marking Patsy Gallagher over in Donegal as well. We've not actually had an event. Patsy's buried just along the MA on the way to Glasgow Airport. We've not had an event there either. So still got lots to do.
It's fascinating. I'm just kind of, I was lost listening to you now. Not very often I'm lost for words, although I think I was when David Law was speaking about Fergus McCann. I get engrossed in these conversations. Right, now listen, that brings me on to another thing you do, because you like to keep busy, obviously. I spoke to you at Celtic AM. You came into Celtic AM. You've been in a few times in Malone's. And you promised to bring me on the Walfrid Walking Tour. And Henry was there. As I mentioned Henry earlier on, and Henry was going, I'd like to go on that. So we booked in with you. You said, well, I'm not starting until, was it April or March or April?
What time, yeah.
I think this was around February, maybe. Yeah, February. And we said, right. I said, I'd love to come over when there's no match on to do it so that you're not rushing. So we agreed to do it, and obviously we didn't plan for the world pandemic. So we spoke briefly, because normally in Malone's, if anyone hasn't been there or hasn't been at a Celtic game show, it's normally 3 or 4 guests. They come up to speak for 15, 20 minutes. It could be a writer, author, player, musician, whatever, but they've all got a love of Celtic or a connection with Celtic. And I don't normally then get time to speak, because at 2:00 we're rushing off to the game. But you did tell me a little bit about the tour, and I was really looking forward to doing it, and I am still looking forward to doing it. What a way to make my triumphal return to Glasgow the day before a game, to go on this walking tour. Well, look, we're living in a virtual life at the moment. You spoke about the virtual season ticket earlier on. Can you take me and the listeners, through this walk? What would we expect? Where would we be? What would we expect to see?
Well, it's really a story of betrayal, Andrew. It's betrayal by Eddie Toner, because one of the inspirations for the walking tour was for me to go and lose a bit of weight by getting out and walking, And so I'd done a couple of articles about Celtic's foundation in that area, St Mary's and the Carlton, the parishes, the 3 parishes. But I thought there's a bit of a kind of unknown element to the story here, and it's the Bridgeton connection to Celtic, and it's to do with Walfrid. So I was living in the Gorbals at the time, after I met my wife, and she was living there and I moved in. And so that meant at lunchtime I could jump on the bike and nip round to the area just down from Celtic Park, between Celtic Park and the river, because I was thinking, and the books were telling me, this is where Glengarry Park was. This is also where Clyde's original ground was, the opposite side of the river from the road ground. And this is where Celtic won their first trophy. This is where Brother Walfrid's youth teams started playing matches. This is kind of Walfrid's early connections with football start coming in as well. And then I was realising, I'm going out on the bike and realising these places, you can now see them again, because there's been so many things, so much renovation done in the east end of Glasgow. A lot of places being knocked down, a lot of places starting to reappear, including where you could tell football grounds had been covered up by tenements and schools and all the rest of it. So from that, I started to get into the story of Bridgeton. And what I found was that I knew that Brother Walfrid started the school there, the Sacred Heart Primary School. He was the first headmaster. So he came from St Mary's School, and that was the job that he had. And this would have been about the 1870s. And interestingly, there was a big Irish population in that part of the East End at that time. Now, Bridgeton, of course, is regarded as an orange area, as a loyalist area. But if you go back to 150 years ago, it's a much more mixed area than the reputation suggests. You had Irish of both Protestant and Catholic origins living in different parts of the village, named after Dublin or Belfast, depending on where the Irish had come from, because a lot of the Beavers were Protestant, originally Scottish ancestry. So Walfrid's charged with starting up this new Catholic primary school in Bridgeton, part of the Sacred Heart Parish. And he has all these ideas based on his experience at St Mary's. And I think from Brendan's research, he was at another school in Glasgow as well, after he'd done his religious training in France. And one of the things that we're all waiting on, and might be coming out soon, I don't know, but we've got a PhD student who's been doing his studies on the Walfrid story. He's been over. Michael, he's been over in Paris, he's been over in France. He's done research there based on the Marist records. And I think we're now going to get a much better understanding of the origins of Brother Walfrid, the background, and indeed the inspirations. So once Michael gets his PhD concluded and it's published, we're going to be in a much better place to understand Walfrid's life story. But Bridgeton is part of that story. And as I said, I begin to realise that a lot of it's still there. Sacred Heart Church is still there. Sacred Heart School, although it's a different building, is still there. As we know, St Mary's Church is still there. All the original parishes for which Celtic were founded to support. The street at the back of the school where the Poor Children's Dinner Table Kitchen was set up, that street's still there. You can still see all that. So then I realised, well, you can tell this story. We can tell this story on foot, starting at Celtic Park, working our way down Glengarry Park, where Walfrid's youth teams played, Clyde's original ground. Celtic won their first ever trophy there at the end of the first season. We didn't win the Scottish Cup. We made it to the final, but we did win the North East Glasgow Football Association Cup. And then from there, in fact, in that, where Glengarry Park was, that became known as the Catholic area of Bridgeton. And then through the last century, when you had the massive gang culture in Glasgow, that was where the clashes were taking place between the Protestant Billy Boys gangs and 2 or 3 different gangs based in that part of Bridgeton. So there's some interesting stories about that. The comedian Janie Godley, I read a thing that she wrote in the newspapers probably a few years ago. She had a pal in one day whose auntie was an expert at cleaning ovens. So Janie Godley's pal came in with her old auntie. So Janie's speaking to her and asking her stories, find out she came from Bridgeton. She's asking her about that. So it turns out that this old woman was part of the Catholic gang, the Norman Conks, in the 1940s and 50s. She helped a group of pals attack an Orange March, hit a guy over the head with a hammer. They got rid of the hammer because these people had assaulted the priest. She had all these incredible stories. This woman in her 80s who was this oven cleaner supreme. So the walking tour is basically an attempt to try and piece all that together out on foot. Generally takes about 2 or 3 years. Celtic Park to Bridgeton.
2 or 3 years?
Sorry. Me explaining it takes 2 or 3 years. It generally takes 2 or 3 hours. Over to St Mary's, and behind St Mary's, we have a look at where the hall was, where Celtic were founded as well, because there's been a lot of confusion about that, and it was Celtic supporters in the Kerrdale Street Forum who got to the heart of that and managed to locate it. And then on to the Gallagate. Obviously, most Celtic fans very well acquainted with the Gallagate, but a lot of the founding fathers lived there. Tommy Burns grew up in the street just off it, very close to where the hall was, where Celtic were originally founded. And then we tell the story of the break clubs, because there's a great drawing of one of the Kimlaki Celtic Break Club, which is the area just behind Celtic Park, heading back into town, as we go up to the first Celtic Park, which again, because of the changes that have been made in the East End, the bars factory's gone. They built flats on it, but you can actually walk through in between the flats, and in the shadow of the current Celtic Park, you can get an idea of what the layout was for the original Celtic Park. Neely McCallum scored the first Celtic goal there, and there's a lot of good history attached to that, which Brendan's covered in his books as well. So the betrayal comes in the fact that, started the tours, Eddie got in touch, Eddie came on board, Eddie just helped improve it, because Eddie's able to tell people about what's happening with the famine statue at St Mary's, the other stories about his involvement with the Brother Walfrid statue in the front of Celtic Park as well. And Eddie was heavily involved in that in the Sports Association. But as I said, the betrayal comes in the fact that this was done by me to help get me to lose some weight, as well as telling the history of Celtic. Pandemic comes, walking tour comes to an end, and now Eddie Toner's gone and shifted about 3 stone in weight on his own. And I'm as fat as ever was before the walking tours even started.
Well, don't worry. There'll be plenty of people after hearing this wanting to get on them walking tours when we get back. when we get back.
I hope so.
I can't wait to do it. And I think now, I'm not boasting, but we do have 1 or 2 listeners. I think you might be inundated when we get back, because there's a few of us have put on a few pounds, and what a way to lose it, going around listening to this fantastic story. And the further you go back, 150 years. Again, Glasgow is such a... My wife always says when we're walking through Glasgow, she always says, look up. And you look up and you see the architecture, and and she's way into history and everything. So I'll probably have to bring on out to Glasgow for that, because every time I go to Glasgow, I go to a game, go for a few beers with the boys, and every time I go with my missus, I see something new. I've been on the tour bus, I've been in every museum, I've been in the People's Palace, and just before the lockdown, the last week she was off with me, she had me under Central Station, and I was freezing. But it was great as well. It was great. But there you go. That's the difference in going with the boys and going with your missus.
It's always a bit different.
Same when we go to Edinburgh, she has me dragged around everywhere, and thankfully, but she never brought me on the Hearts walking tour. But that could be another story. What Paul does within Celtic fandom is remarkable. One of the longest chats I've had for the podcast, but I'm sure you will agree it was worth keeping the old tape recorder running. A quality conversation, and trust me, the second part is every bit as good. Paul talks about Johnny Doyle and even climbs into the Tim time machine and takes us back to some of his glory days and memories. So don't forget to tune in for the next podcast. Mud 90 Minutes issue 113 is just about finished and about to go to the graphic designer. So you can now pre-order the print edition by visiting the website celticfanzine.com, where you'll find the link. And there'll also be a link on the podcast description here. So once again, thanks very much for supporting the fanzine as we enter our 20th year of producing it. And I suppose they said print would die, but there's obviously a market out there with the Celtic fans, because they still like getting the hard copy, and it outsells the digital copy. So that's something. But don't let that put you off. You can still download the digital copy for half the price. As always, I have to thank my producer, Ronan McQuillan, for quality production. And once again, if you like what we're doing with the fanzine and the podcast, and you would like to support us, visit CelticFanzine.com, where you can become a member, subscribe, buy or donate for the price of a pint. Don't forget to visit the website for our articles and news, and also check out a new feature we have, which is the weekend long read. Last week, David Potter put up one on Jimmy Quinn, and this week we'll have another one up as well. So well worth reading if you have a bit of time on your hands. Sit down with a cup of coffee when you finish listening to the podcast and read some of David's stuff. He's absolutely excellent. You can also download the app. It's free, and you'll have access to the podcast, articles, daily news, video, blah, 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 blah. The fanzine, the online shop, all at the touch of a button on your phone or tablet. All episodes of the podcast are available on all platforms, so hit the subscribe or follow button so you never miss an episode. And if you're on our Instagram page, you can go directly into Spotify. As I said earlier, there's no TikTok or Snapchat for us, but you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and we also have a page on LinkedIn. And again, all details are in the podcast description. Thanks again to our episode sponsor, Nave Porrick Celtic Supporters Club up in Dublin. Thank you so much, boys and girls, for the continued support. And again, see the podcast description for anyone who wants to join Dublin's premier Celtic Supporters Club. And as always, we're looking for businesses who are Celtic-minded and Celtic Supporters Clubs to come on board and sponsor a podcast. Email us at info@celticfanzine.com or through the website or on social media. If you enjoyed the conversation of today's guest, Paul McQuade, and would like to listen to more of the same, his pal Eddie Toner was with us for episode 48. Johnny Doyle's teammate, George McCluskey, spoke to us in episode 42. And our old friend, Average Joe Miller from Not The View, joined us in episode 37. And he was also our first ever guest on episode 1, along with the Hun Scalper Supreme, Alan Tomo Thompson. So it's Motherwell up next for Celtic at Paradise on Saturday. Enjoy the weekend, get out and about in the fresh air, and if you're feeling down, make sure you talk to someone. Don't bottle it up. There's always someone there to listen. We want to continue our support for musicians and artists who have been hit the hardest by the lockdown restrictions with no gigs and no venues to play in. So send in your material, we'll give you a plug and we'll play out of each show. And this week we play out with the Blarney Pilgrims classic When Saturday Comes Around from the magnificent Granda Was a Celtic Man album, which has been reissued and is now available on Spotify. So that's all for this episode, folks. Stay tuned, stay safe, and as always, keep the faith.
This city's not much Christ, I know that's true. There's not much to do here between me and you. It's not Paris, it's not Rome, it's not Amsterdam. But we do the best we can. But when Saturday comes around, this town will be our town. When Saturday comes around, we'll paint the place green. I've been here so long now, I call it my home. The good people I've met here, I call my own. I met them one night at Celtic Park, with the floodlights shining in the Glasgow dark. And when the crowd all sang the old songs, I felt at home. When I stood up and sang along, I didn't feel so alone. Hail, hail, we'll have a party tonight. Hail, hail, we'll chase away the blues tonight. Whenever I go home now, it's always the same. Have you got a couple of tickets for the next home game? We'll come over for the weekend and we'll have the crack. And maybe like yourself, we won't go back. Everywhere I go, they wanna talk about paradise. What's the news? What's happening over there in paradise? Hail, hail, we'll have a party tonight. Hail, hail, we'll chase away the blues tonight. And I'll take your hand and we'll walk by the Clyde, head into the Calton and we'll drink all night. Hail, hail, we'll have a party. A kushla, a store, we'll have a party. There's a pretty little girl lives in Inchicore. She's flying into Glasgow this Friday at 4. She phoned the other night just to see, could she please spend the whole weekend with me? When Saturday comes around, this town will be our town. And my Roisin will paint the place green. Hail, hail, we'll have a party tonight. Hail, hail, we'll chase away the blues tonight. Hail, hail, we'll have a party tonight. Hail, hail, we'll chase away